Well, we're starting out and it's just another normal day in my gardening life because Stuart's making fun of me. We're working on a project showing you what some of my favorite gardening books are. It's kind of cold and it's blustery out today, so it's the perfect time to come inside and do something that's a little bit cozier and a little bit warmer. But first, I want to give you guys a shout out. All of you who helped me remember from one of our previous videos, the nursery rhyme, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. So many of you were able to remember that on my behalf, and I really appreciate it. It's been a while since I have read any nursery rhymes to my kids. I also want to give you a big shout out for all of the brilliant ideas you guys gave me for this cast iron container. I think I'm going to have to execute every one of them over time, and particularly as the seasons change. But you guys came up with ideas I never would have thought of. So I really appreciate that. And I'll try to, in some manner, post pictures of how I decide to style it. So now, back to gardening books. I became an avid gardener in the 80s and the 90s. So the most influential books for me were books that were written about that, around that time. And they helped me define and kind of establish my own gardening style and my gardening aesthetic. So those are the ones I want to show you today. Some of them may be out of print, but you can find them at used bookstores. You may be able to find them online, on eBay, on Used and New, on Amazon. But nevertheless, I think you'll still be able to find them someplace. So number one, this is one of this isn't, I wouldn't say a really helpful book, but it's one of the sweetest books I've ever gotten, garden books. And I have given 100 of these away. It's Sarah Mitta's In and Out of the Garden. And it just has the sweetest little illustrations in here. They're watercolors. She does all of them in, I think when she paints them in this same size. But it's just a really sweet book, and I look at it frequently for both inspiration and also for just a reminder of how romantic and sweet, especially around Easter time, that the garden can be. So that is Sarah Mitta, In and Out of the Garden. She also has a darling book called Sarah Mitta's South of France, a sketchbook. So if you guys are into sketching and recording and documenting your garden via watercolors or drawings or something along those lines, these two would be really very helpful to you. So those are my first two. Now, above all other garden designers and garden authors, Rosemary Vater, so many of you I know are familiar with her. Those were my first books that just really sent me on a mission to really establish my own garden style. And because of that, I read these. I was able to go see Barnsley House, which is now a hotel and spa in the Cotswolds. But back then, in the 80s and 90s, she was still alive. She still tended it, and she still lived there. So during that period of time, I had the opportunity to go and visit. So what's fun is now I have my own photographs of some of the photographs of areas of her garden that were in these books that were so inspirational to me. It's so fun, don't you think, to see a garden in real life after you've only seen it 1,000 times in pictures? And you will recognize many of the images in these books because they're so famous. They've been in magazines, they've been all over the place. So probably the first one, and she has a number of them out, and I would recommend every one of them. If you can't find one, then you won't go wrong taking a look at another one and maybe purchasing another one. But the very first one I looked at was The Making of a Garden. This was where I first became obsessed with the idea of a potager and kind of creating my own potager. You can see here that the pictures that I took way back when, I keep in here. I still refer to this book constantly, not only because it very much has an English gardening aesthetic that so informed my own garden, but also because the writing is really just beautiful and it's got lots of pictures. I'm not one, I don't know what this says about me, I really have to have eye candy in my books. It does a lot more for me than just factual information. And most of these books that I'm going through today are, I think they spoke to me because they were beautifully written and beautifully captured in in pictures. Other books that I have are in a different category, and those I would think of as more encyclopedic or referential. They're two different categories for me. But these, in terms of the formulation of my own garden and own garden style, number one in my heart and on my bookshelf is Rosemary Vater. So this one is The Making of a Garden. She has another one, Rosemary Vater's Garden Plans. This one, The Art of Planting, and she will give you really particular planting combinations, some that of course aren't practical for me in my Zone 7 garden here in Oklahoma, but nevertheless I can look at it and deconstruct and analyze some of what she's done and see how I can interpret it in my own garden. So that would be my first category of books to look for. I'll put a link below to any I can find online. She also has some that she's got one called The Country Woman's Garden, and I think she even wrote one about American gardens. She died not that long ago, but she was a wealth of information. She designed a garden for Prince Charles at one point in time. She was kind of a character. So, and there's also a really good biography about her that's also out if you become as fascinated with her as I did. So that is my first kind of combo of gardening books, Rosemary Vater. The second one that I love is by Lauren Springer, and I believe she is still actively writing, and this is The Undaunted Garden. Now, that's for obvious reasons, because it's so difficult to grow anything in Oklahoma because of our extremes of heat and cold and wind and hail and rain and anything else, snow. And obviously, I need tips on how to grow an undaunted garden. So she provides just a wealth of information. For example, she has a whole list in here of plants that are hail tolerant. So by all means, you want to check out this book. It's by Lauren Springer, and it's really wonderful for weather resilient beauty. So this is another one I would put on my list. I don't know if it's in print or out of print, but maybe you can find a copy someplace. I also would recommend anything that she has written, because she manages to blend both beautiful imagery with really wonderful practical tips. Now, first, maybe in my heart of being both a gardener and a mother is this very old book. It's called A Vineyard Garden by Molly Chapelet. And this was, I think, the book that first inspired my connection of gardening as a metaphor, gardening to life, and simultaneously raising a family and creating a garden at the same time. She created a garden in Napa Valley along with her husband. I believe the vineyard is still a working, operating business. But her book, it just on so many levels, it spoke to me. The writing is beautiful. The graphics are beautiful. Just everything about it is just, I think, really breathtaking. And I got this, like I say, I don't know how many years ago, and I have given multiple copies of it away. I bet you can still find copies of it that are used and pre-loved, but I would highly recommend this, A Vineyard Garden. I don't think she's writing anymore. The other thing that she did that has really begun to resonate with me now, and that is that she talks a lot about using edibles as ornamentals, but also just as vegetables being beautiful in their own right, in and out of the garden and as centerpieces. Just so many brilliant ideas in this book, so I would highly recommend it. Excuse me. Another author I would highly recommend. She is my new heroine, and that is Helen Dillon. She's not a new heroine. She's an old heroine, because I have followed her for many, many years, and I love this. Every time of year around St. Patrick's Day, I think of her, because I visited her Dublin garden right in the heart of Dublin on St. Patrick's Day, I don't know how many years ago. I was the only one visiting. She and her husband were both there, and she gave me a private tour of her garden, which is just, it is just fabulous. And we walked around. She asked me what designers had influenced me. I asked her what we like to grow. We shared all sorts of things. And that's where the biggest takeaway after visiting it with her for quite a long time was that we always want to grow what we can't grow. And the things that seemed common to me, prairie plants and things of that nature that were hard for her to grow, she really coveted, and vice versa. So she was just, and she's also somebody who just really inspired me that you can just be so classy and kind of stylish in the garden. Now, why she is a current inspiration to me, you guys, is she recently sold that fabulous garden in Dublin, and she's in her 80s now, in her mid 80s, I believe, maybe even upper 80s. And she moved to the seaside where she's creating a whole new beautiful seaside garden, and I just love that. I love the resilience of it. I love the arrogance of it. I just love everything about it, that she is still gardening and creating and providing inspiration for all of us even now. So she's got several books out. You can find a number of them. You'll also recognize some of the images of gardens that she has in her landscape, because they too have been in hundreds of magazines. And again, it was one of those that was fun to visit after I had seen so many images of it. So I've got two here. One is Helen Dillon on gardening, and the other is Down to Earth with Helen Dillon. Now, the other thing about her is she is a great writer, and she's funny. She is, she just has a great sense of humor, and I love that about her. So she frames things in a way that will help you remember them as a gardening application. And I could not speak more highly of her. She was so gracious. In fact, after we visited her on St. Patrick's Day in her Dublin garden, I said, well, we need to catch a taxi to get back to the hotel. She drove me back in her own car. Now, I have to tell you, I was so awestruck. This was a gardener that I had followed for years. She was just a rock star in the gardening world. And for her to offer to give me a ride back in her car, which, by the way, you guys, was just a little sedan that had all sorts of dirt in the trunk and things, she just captured my heart in so many ways. She was a lovely, lovely creature. And here's a tip, you guys. Afterwards, I sent her as a thank you gift one of, who is it, David Fitzgerald, that does the beautiful photography books on the different states. Anyhow, I think he did one on Oklahoma. And so I sent her one of David Fitzgerald's beautiful Oklahoma books, because I wanted her to get a sense of what our landscape was like, and she wrote me the most gracious note. So if you want to get something in a famous person's handwriting, then send them a gift, because chances are they'll write you a lovely thank you note. It's one of my treasured possessions now. So Helen Dillon, you will love her work. Another book, not so much as a writer, but another book that is just wonderful, again, this is an old one, is by Lyndon Hawthorne, and it is Gardening with Shape, Line, and Texture. And this was one of the first influential books in my gardening library that made me start to it put into words what I was beginning to intuit in my garden about the importance of good garden bones, about structural evergreens, about moods related with certain plants and certain forms in the garden, the difference between, verticality and something that is horizontal, and the different kind of atmosphere you can create with both garden ornament and plants to help establish a mood and a feel for your garden. It was wonderful. It's got great planting suggestions, not a lot of montages of landscape pictures, but lots of specific individual images of plants that you might use and how you might use them. Now here's another one I know all of you will be familiar with, and that is all of P. Allen Smith's books. Now, I like them because they're so accessible. They've got a great number of inspirational pictures that you could just replicate easily. He knows his stuff 2 years ago on my birthday, I and some friends of mine, my friend Roger that you've met before, we went up to Moss Mountain Farm, and he could not be more gracious. I sat next to him at lunch. We had great conversations about garden design. He was very lovely, and he's got a number of wonderful books out that, again, I think are really accessible to those of us in America and beyond in terms of his ideas of a gardening lifestyle, container plantings, and different ideas you can use in combination with them. What I love about his books is that a lot of his plants and garden ornament, things of that nature, he shows you in situ, and he gives you an idea of how they will look, not just in isolation and in a vacuum, but how they will look in the landscape in different settings. He can also tell you about what performs really well and what doesn't perform well, along with all sorts of how-to and design tips. It's very digestible. I think of all of the books that I read, his are some of the most digestible, with some of the quickest tips that you can easily replicate. I love all of them. And then there is another book that I forgot to put here, but that I also want to highly recommend, and that is all of Rosalind Creasy's books. She does so many. Stuart's nodding his head. Stuart, have you read some of her books? No, but he's heard me speak about them before. And so he at least recognized her name. She is just wonderful. She has written so many different books on the edible landscape. In fact, I'm very proud. She came and visited my garden during a garden writers tour years ago, and some of my garden, the potager, is fairly prominent in some of the images in that book, the edible landscape or the edible garden. But she has a number of them out: the edible salad garden, the edible flower garden, the edible herb garden. All of those are just wonderful eye candy. Again, I'm going to try to put links to all of these things below. They are brilliant. And as the thing is, over time, as you're building your garden library, these books become not just reference materials, but they become old friends. And I love the fact they age over time. I have put notations in some of them. I do refer to them frequently. I have two different kind of gardening libraries. My design books tend to be more downstairs, and my how-to technical books tend to be upstairs in my office. But that said, I'm culling out a lot of my gardening books that are redundant, that really don't speak to me anymore. And I would say for every 3 books that I'm getting rid of, I'm only acquiring 1, which is pretty good for me, on different styles of gardening that I'm now gravitating to. Because in the next several years, I plan to start a new garden, and I want it to look in some ways similar and in some ways different than the garden that I have now. So by all means, start a gardening library. It's my default thing if somebody wants to know what to get me for Christmas or as a Christmas gift. It's my default thing. I have a list of books that I want, and I can easily tell people, oh, here's the whole list. Get anything on this list. So they're absolutely wonderful. They're good literary garden friends. Flowers and books and gardens are my favorite things in the world, and these have, like I say, they've just become a part of my family. So a couple of other things. I recently launched the Linda Vater memberships on the Linda Vater channel. You can easily do that. The content here will continue to be free for you, but if you want a few more perks, if you want some special emojis, if you want a newsletter that I put out, if you want a gardening list of to-dos, if you want ultimately to be in a private Facebook group, then all of those you can access through a member to become a member on my membership channel. So all you have to do is just click the join. It's next to the subscribe button on your laptop. There's a way you can do it on your phone that's a little trickier, but there's a way that I'll share with you later on how to become a member on the Linda Vater channel. Thank you guys for hanging out with me. Make sure to comment below, like, share, all of that good stuff. But from my garden library to yours, have a great weekend.